Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Monday, the 3rd of March. So, last class, as I had indicated, I was having some plumbing issues. So, I posted an old recording that I had done for a previous semester. And in that recording, I was talking about Soldier's Home and Young Goodman Brown, which I'll briefly talk about today, and there wasn't an attendance question for that particular class. So today what I want to do is to finish up with our fiction section, because as you know, your first paper will be due fairly soon, and while I have rolling deadlines and you can hand in your paper at any point, what I'm hopeful is that you've handed in your paper by the midpoint of the semester so that you can begin to get some feedback. Once we finish our fiction section, you would have finished all of the pieces that could be examined in a fiction paper, since you have to address one of the pieces of fiction, whether it be the film Citizen Kane or one of the short stories that we've been talking about. Also, what that means is that next class I want to talk a little bit about writing papers and the convention of writing papers as we transition over into drama. But at this point, Battle Royal and Popular Mechanics will be the way that we end our fiction section. Last class, I had you read Soldier's Home, a piece by Ernest Hemingway, and Hemingway was part of um, World War One. So it would seem that in some ways this story is a reflection on some of his thoughts about his own experiences in war. And some of the things I asked you to think about, as I always ask you to think about when you're reading a piece of fiction, is to think about the significance of the title, the distinction between a house, which is where our main character is in, as opposed to a home where you feel welcomed. And certainly Krebs is way misunderstood. And thinking about names, Krebs being a surname, which takes away the individuality of a person. That's why surnames are oftentimes used in the military. Krebs also means cancer in German, and cancer is really what war is. It's a kind of cancer that continues to grow. And of course, thinking about other names like Krebs's nickname, Hare, Hare, rabbit, something that's skittish, for instance, or that hides. And also thinking about some of the conflicts that Krebs experiences. And he came from conflict. That's the irony. He came back from war, but he is in the midst of a whole new, different kind of war. And it's a war within himself and with his family and with his society, who thinks that he's returned too late, as if such a thing is even possible. And he doesn't want any close relationships because he doesn't want consequences, because that's going to be too difficult in the event that something were to happen to that relationship. The need to try to protect oneself at all costs is probably one of the results of war. And probably all of his responses, from telling his mother that he doesn't love her to not being able to pray, are all results of being in the war. And we know that that ending, which is somewhat ambiguous, could either be seen as positive for Krebs when he decides to leave home and get a job and integrate into society, which on the surface seems like a good thing, but also could be negative because we certainly don't get the sense that he's ready to do such things. He's not getting the help or the support that he needs. And one could be saying that he's just running away from his problems. But we know that his family is going to continue to insist that he be, quote, normal, unquote, whatever that means. And the bribe of the car is not going to make a difference for Krebs. If anything, it's just going to put more pressure on him, because he knows that that car comes with expectations and consequences. That it's assumed that he will get a job and he will date and marry and establish a home, all of the things that he's not ready to do. Instead, what he does is he spends his time with solitary activities like reading about the war, no less, and liking the maps, because Krebs is basically lost and looking for direction. And the fact that he's playing pool, where you basically aim and shoot, which is what you do in the military, all very deliberate from Hemingway. And then we've got Young Goodman Brown. And Young Goodman Brown, very different piece, obviously, much more complex probably in terms of the writing. But very much an examination of the Puritan era. And this is how Massachusetts was settled by the Puritans, who were a very strict religious sect, who were persecuted in England. So they came and they established a New England in Massachusetts, in Salem, and then they began to persecute individuals who showed basically different religious beliefs than their own. How's that for hypocrisy and irony? Which is what Young Goodman Brown is all about, exposing hypocrisy. But during the time of Puritanism, people were viewed as either holy or corrupt and nothing in between. So young Goodman Brown, he's young because he's innocent and naive, and he's Goodman because he's a good man, though Goodman would also be used as a title, and Brown because he will soon be soiled when the reality of the world strikes him. After all, he will be in the wilderness as well, which is wild and untamed. And this piece, which is basically an allegory, everything is symbolic. So when Faith, his wife, tries to hold him back, this is also his religious faith. And he continues on this journey that he knows is dangerous and probably sinful, but he does it anyway, which goes to show that everyone, regardless of being good or not, is tempted into evil at some point. But Goodman never accepts that about himself. He comes across a figure where it would seem that this figure is leading a witch meeting, and all of the leading citizens of the town are there, and Goodman is horrified that all these individuals could be involved in evil, whether they be the church ministers or the politicians or Goody Cloyce, who taught him his catechism, which is basically like a Sunday school teacher. Goodman's own family, even Faith perhaps herself. And at the ending, it would seem that we don't know if Goodman Brown actually experienced these things, or was it a figment of his imagination? Because this is a deliberately ambiguous text. One might say people are ambiguous too. We're not good or evil. We're a bit of both. And every time there's a piece of evidence to suggest that a supernatural event is going on, such as the staff the man is carrying seems to wriggle like a snake. Of course, snakes have lots of biblical references associated with them in terms of evil and seduction and temptation. But then that must have been a, quote, ocular deception. In other words, he must be seeing things. And the author himself, Nathaniel Hawthorne, even asks us, had Goodman Brown fallen asleep in a witch meeting? And the answer is, be it so if you will. In other words, yes, if you want to believe that, because that is not the point. And we will never be able to find any evidence to prove whether there was or was not a witch meeting definitively. And Hawthorne did that purposefully. What Hawthorne wants us to focus on is that there is evil and hypocrisy in the world, regardless of how good one presents oneself as being. That would have been seen as rather radical for Puritan times. And also that we can't let that destroy our faith, if you will. Because ultimately, what Goodman's life becomes, he becomes a sad, sternly meditative man, is not what we want, where there was no hopeful verse upon his tomb. So I thought those two pieces could lead us into Battle Royal, which is a more complicated piece in some respects because it comes from a novel. And if we had the time, we would read the novel called Invisible Man, not The Invisible Man, but which is a science fiction story, but Invisible Man. But the good news is that the first chapter of that novel appeared as an independent short story. So that's the short story that we're reading. And it's basically an adult narrator who's reflecting back on his youth and talking about the fact that he's invisible because of his ethnicity. He's black. And keep in mind the time in which this was written, 1947. So this would be seen as a very progressive text. And it begins with the narrator talking about the grandfather on his deathbed And if you're ever going to tell the truth, it's on your deathbed, saying that he'd been a spy in the enemy's country, that he lived with his head in the lion's mouth, and you should overcome him with yeses. So, what the grandfather is saying that the invisible man doesn't yet believe or even understand is that humility is an act. In order to be able to gain access to those in power, to be able to try to overthrow the system. This is what the grandfather's been doing his entire life. He's not meek or humble, really. He's pretending to be meek or humble. So he's been a spy in the enemy's country. So basically, gathering recognizance, the enemy being Caucasian society. He's lived with his head in the lion's mouth. Think about the dangers of living with your head in the lion's mouth. And he's been overcoming them with yeses. So the invisible man needs to really understand and learn what this means. And it begins with his experience in Battle Royal, where he's invited to some of the leading citizens of the town to listen to his graduation speech, which is about the power of meekness. And instead, what Invisible Man finds is that he wasn't invited to give his speech. He was invited to be humiliated and brutalized. And it begins with a boxing match that has been set up. Such a great symbolic idea that we are all in a boxing match, but particularly those of color. And that everything has been rigged against them because the Invisible Man finds out that all of this had been rigged and he's left with the strongest boxer in the boxing ring. This is after he has been brutalized and has been bruised and beaten. This is after he's been humiliated by being shown the image of a naked blonde. And these men are all forced, all of his fellow boxers are all forced to look at this naked blonde, knowing that this could result in death, looking at a white woman, especially a naked white woman. And this piece is as much about gender as it is about ethnicity, because the woman is treated as a piece of meat and just tossed around. And she has the tattoo of an American flag, again, very deliberate as well. She's supposed to represent America. You can look, but you can't touch. That's the idea of the American dream that's really only available to a select few. All of those messages are sort of embedded in this particular story. And then after that, when Invisible Man tries to make a deal with the last remaining boxer and is basically told no, because this is the only way that the boxer, his competition, can get any kind of acknowledgement or any kind of respect is by winning the fight, then they have to continue on with trying to get their quote payment unquote, which is minimal and is on an electrified rug. Electricity will be an important theme in the novel as a whole because electricity is used as a symbol for power. Who has it and who doesn't. And as the men are electrified and getting the tokens, they find out that it's not even money, it's all a lie. Because again, everything has been rigged against them. And then when Invisible Man finally is able to give his speech, he makes a mistake. Though, if you're a student of psychology, you might argue that there is no such thing as a mistake. That usually when we misspeak, it could, or not usually, but often when we misspeak, it could be viewed as a subconscious attempt to say something that we wouldn't consciously say. Instead of saying social responsibility, he says social equality, which is obviously very different, especially in 1947, and the room comes to a standstill. And in one of my favorite lines, the Invisible Man says he was swallowing blood, so please forgive him. And that's both literal and figurative. And then ultimately, Invisible Man is presented with what seems to be a good thing. It is a briefcase, and think about all the associations with briefcases: business people, success, professionalism, and inside is a scholarship for the quote Negro unquote college. And that would seem to be positive, except we're given a little bit of foreshadowing when Invisible Man has a nightmare at the ending of that about his grandfather, and that they're at a circus and the grandfather refuses to laugh at the clowns. In other words, the grandfather refuses to do what's expected of him. And think about how clowns are supposed to be innocent and humorous, but oftentimes they can be rather insidious. So perhaps this is also a reference to the idea that Invisible Man is surrounded by clowns. And the grandfather has him open up envelope after envelope after envelope to find out. It's almost like those nesting dolls, if you've ever seen them, where he's told to keep running. And yes, the N word is used, so this is an uncomfortable text, but it's important, I think, from a historical perspective. And then he awakens, and ultimately he says that he needs to go to college to understand what the true meaning of that dream is. So even though I could never substitute for your actually reading the book, I'm going to tell you what happens in the book. And the book begins with a prologue that you didn't have access to. What you had access to was that first chapter, which is basically the short story that was published on its own. But the prologue, Invisible Man as an Adult, has basically broken into an all Caucasian neighborhood, into a basement that is filled with darkness. But he has found a way to rig up hundreds of electric lights. He's stealing power from the power company, another symbol there. So he's both in dark and light. And darkness and light is our major themes in this particular piece. And he talks about how he's hibernating. And the idea behind hibernating is that one assumes, that after a while one will take action. But what he needs to do is to tell the story of how he became an invisible man. And he does so by beginning with Battle Royal and what happens at that boxing match and the deliverance of his graduation speech. And then after that, he spends a couple of hundred pages or so talking about his time in college. And what ends up happening is he realizes that was just as rigged as the boxing match, that college will provide opportunity and respect only for a select few, certainly not for someone like Invisible Man because of the color of his skin. So then he decides that what he needs to do is to is to work within the system for change. So he joins the political world to try to change this rigged system. And after about a couple of hundred pages or so, he realizes that that too is rigged, and the political system is not going to allow him to have any kind of voice or to engage in any kind of meaningful change. So he meets a character who's aptly named Ross the Destroyer because he basically destroys. And Ross convinces Invisible Man that what they need to do is to tear down the whole system, revolution, and start all over again. And Invisible Man does that for about a couple hundred pages or so. This is a long novel. And basically, when the community is in shambles and there's a riot where ultimately everything is burning down around him, Invisible Man realizes that certainly isn't the answer because he's just destroying his community and hurting his own people. So what he does at the ending is he goes into an all Caucasian neighborhood where he would never be allowed to live, and he breaks into a basement that's filled with darkness, but he rigs up hundreds of electric lights so that he is surrounded by light even though he's in the darkness because he's stealing power. In other words, the novel ends the way it begins. So it's circular. And we're told again that he's in that basement thinking about what his next move is going to be, so to speak. Now that he's been unsuccessful with education and with the political realm and with revolution, and that he's hibernating, which assumes that he's taking a break and that he will emerge and take action, but we're not told what that action is, which I think is a brilliant way to end this novel, because rather than giving us an easy answer for something like racism, again, could think about the time period, 1947, or something like sexism, because again, the woman in that boxing match very much illustrates how the leading citizens of the town, notice they're all male. Notice they're dressed in tuxedos, which are black and white. Notice they're smoking black cigars. They're consuming things that are black. Um, This is all very deliberate by the author Ralph Ellison. Lots of symbolism going on here. You might have noticed that the scholarship Invisible Man is given. It's wrapped in white tissue paper. Again, lots of white and dark imagery. Tissue paper is very insubstantial. It's very thin, easily ripped, not very hardy. So all of that is very deliberate in terms of what Ellison was doing. And what we see is that this story is very much perhaps an impetus for some of the protests that occurred in the next decade or two. I've oftentimes said that art has led to political and social revolution, as well as has reflected political and social revolution. So certainly things have changed since the 1940s, but sadly, as much as they've changed, they've also remained the same as well. And the greatness about this particular book is that it reads like a short story in terms of its care with language and symbolism. So the author is able to keep that up for hundreds of pages, which is usually something that you can only do for a short amount of time, something like a short story that's just a few pages long. Um, for better or worse, Ellison was rather young when he wrote this, and he was never really able to achieve something to equal or surpass it. It almost reminds me in some ways of Orson Welles and making Citizen Kane so early on in his life, and then basically living in the shadow of that. But I wanted to at least give you a taste of something that is a novel, even though we don't necessarily have the time to read a novel. But our last piece, Popular Mechanics, as short as it is probably just as powerful, albeit in a different way. And the author, Raymond Carver, is known for a kind of writing style known as minimalism. Less is more. And I know we saw a little bit of that with Hemingway, where things were very deliberate. But especially with minimalism is that you strip away all unnecessary language. So we've got something that's only a page and a half long or so, and oftentimes it's in dialogue, so which makes it even shorter. But that said, it's incredibly powerful. And the title, popular, so this suggests something that is popular or common. Mechanics, these are, if you look up one of the definitions of mechanics, two forces working against one another, which is exactly what we find in this particular story. You might be familiar with a magazine, actually, that's still in publication. Popular Mechanics is its name, and it basically was a kind of do-it-yourself publication about how to repair things or make things. This is definitely a story that does the exact opposite. What we get are a series of instructions, if you will, about how to destroy things, and things being relationship. Think about the time period in which this was written, 1981. So at the time, divorce was becoming more popular or commonplace, but certainly not in the way that it is in 2025. And you might have noticed that the dialogue of the couple, who are basically ending their relationship, none of their dialogue is in quotation marks. And I'd argue that that's quite important, that it helps to universalize their dialogue, because usually we use quotation marks to attribute a particular quote or particular language or idea to a specific person. And I would also argue that their dialogue is so commonplace and universal that for all couples who are breaking up, that it really doesn't require quotation marks. I'm glad you're leaving, you son of a bitch. I'm glad you're leaving happens to be one of the quotes there, for instance. And we're given a setting very briefly about how things are getting dark, and things are indeed getting dark, and about how the snow is turning into slush. So again, something that's white and perhaps positive is turning into something negative. And we're also told that there's a little shoulder high window that looks out into the back. a very different kind of sense than what we would have seen with something like The Story of an Hour, where we had a Mrs. Mallard looking out an open window and seeing all the birds around her. And we get a little bit of foreshadowing as this couple is breaking up, where they're arguing over the picture of their baby. And of course, you can't split a picture in half, that would ruin the picture. Keep that in mind as they continue to argue. And then we know that they move into the kitchen, usually a room that is associated with family and with togetherness. But in this instance, they're in the middle of a bitter argument over who is going to get custody of this child. The baby is screaming and red-faced. Obviously, there's something wrong with the child, but neither parent stops to think about the welfare of the child. They hold the child over a stove, which is a very dangerous place, knock over a flower pot, a little bit of foreshadowing here, how they break something that's alive. And then ultimately, as they're both pulling on the baby, in this manner, the issue was decided. And we aren't told what happens, but basically, what they've done is they've torn that child in two physically. And it is actually a story that is a takeoff of a biblical story. The Bible oftentimes helps to inspire pieces of literature. And it is the story of Solomon that you might be familiar with the Bible, where King Solomon was approached by two women who both claimed to be the mother of a baby. And Solomon encouraged them to come to some resolution, and they refused. So Solomon said the only fair thing to do was to split the child in two, and they could each have half. And the biological mother steps forward and says, no, let the other woman have the child. And Solomon says to the woman who stepped forward, you must be the biological mother, because only a biological mother would be willing to sacrifice herself for the welfare of a child, her child. And the moral or the lesson is that a parent would put the welfare of their child above their own welfare and above their own needs. What Popular Mechanics is about is a modern day retelling of the story of Solomon, when what happens when neither parent is willing to put the welfare of the child above their needs. And notice we aren't told why the couple is arguing, because quite frankly, it doesn't matter. In the end, all that matters is the welfare of the child, which both of them refuse to acknowledge because they're too bent on, quote, winning. Um, and that means having possession of the child. And I certainly hope that things aren't as violent in our society that a child would ever be literally physically ripped in two. But think about how this works so well as a metaphor for what happens to children emotionally and intellectually in the midst of a divorce or in the ending of a relationship of their parents, that ultimately the child is torn between the two and is forced to take sides. Oftentimes the child is also physically made to live in two different locales at the same time. So think about this particular piece, especially in its time period. We're talking about late 70s, early 80s, as really prophetic about the damaging effects of divorce or the ending of relationship on children, and that the focus should be on the child. If you are reading this story in our textbook, or at least the version of the book that I had assigned for class, one of the questions at the end will tell you that the story was initially entitled Mine, which makes a lot of sense because they're basically arguing over the child as a possession. In fact, at one point, they even use the pronoun it to refer to the child. She would have it, this child. And it is for a thing, not a person. But that said, um, even though Mine might be a more obvious title, I personally like Popular Mechanics a little bit more. Of course, this is subjective, but I like the idea of needing to think about what a title might mean. And I think Popular Mechanics as a title requires you to think a little bit more than Mine might have necessarily encouraged you to think about. But again, titles are subjective. And as you can see, you can make a statement in hundreds of pages, or as is done in Invisible Man, or you can make a statement in one-ish pages, which is what we do with Popular Mechanics, or someplace in between. And that basically will put closure onto our fiction section. So I thought what would be useful today is talking about the three longer short stories, Young Goodman Brown, which I had referenced last class and this class, Soldier's Home, which I had referenced last class and this class, and lastly, Battle Royal, which I referenced this class, for you to find an important quote from one of those three stories and indicate why you think it's important. And hopefully individuals will choose different quotes so that basically we'll have a nice overview of some of the important quotes in these three stories. Just because Popular Mechanics is so short, I'm not going to give that as an option. I'll just have the first three that we talked about. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. And then what will happen next class is that we get introduced to the idea of drama. Drama is very different than short story. Obviously, dramas are longer. So we will have multiple classes that are devoted to each of the dramas. And dramas are meant to be performed. So we'll talk about the idea of performance. Ideally, we would be watching live performance, but logistically, that's going to be a little bit too difficult. So we will watch films performance. Not necessarily a bad thing, since this is a film class as well as a literature class. And what would be ideal, though I know the world isn't always ideal, is that when we first talk about a drama, and our first major drama will be Oedipus the King, that you would have read it in its entirety so that as we're talking about it over several classes, you're reading the next drama, which happens to be A Midsummer Night's Dream. And then when we're talking about Midsummer Night's Dream for several classes, and also watching performance, we'll watch performance for all three of these dramas. You're at home reading the last drama, which is Raisin in the Sun, so that when we are talking about Raisin in the Sun, at that point, you'd be working on your second paper. But right now, we're working on our first paper. So I'll talk some more about paper number 1 next class. Also introduce the idea of drama for our next class. And I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on soon. Take care. Bye-bye.